I spent 10 hours as a professional video game coach playing the Marvel Rivals Alpha and trying to decide if it was any good. This is what you need to know. Now, first off, is this the Overwatch 2 killer? I've been seeing that a lot recently from a lot of different content creators discussing it, whether it's good, whether it's bad. I'm going to give you both sides of the issue as best as I possibly can, things that I think Overwatch 2 does better, things that I think Marvel Rivals did better, and more importantly here, how actually maybe in some ways that comparison is fundamentally flawed. We'll get to that in a little one. First off, bias alert, I am a professional Overwatch 2 coach. I enjoy Overwatch and I enjoy Overwatch 2. So there's a little bit of survivorship bias that the type of person that's still playing Overwatch 2 nowadays is somebody that's going to be enjoying some of those aspects that keep them in Overwatch 2 and maybe not enjoying some of the more unique aspects of Marvel Rivals that are different from Overwatch 2. So just keep that in mind. It is a hero shooter. It does have abilities, and there are tank, DPS, and support, no matter what they may call it, in Marvel Rivals. But ultimately, there's so many things that make Marvel Rivals unique, not just in terms of the feel, but the overall structure of the game, that I think it is a disservice to both Overwatch and, more importantly, to Marvel Rivals to always make that comparison. We just need to ask ourselves, is the game fun? If the game is fun, then that's really all that matters. And it is 6v6 like Overwatch 1, but there's no real tank synergy. There's no roll lock. Tanks are often slow and awkward, and right now there's no immediate tank busters. At least the strongest heroes right now are not tank busters. And so it's hard to really decide exactly how this tank game feels in terms of the 6v6 versus Overwatch 1, Overwatch 2. Just because it's 6v6 doesn't just mean that it's an Overwatch 1 clone. Different fan bases, just because it's a hero shooter with abilities, doesn't mean that this is going to be yet again the game that's going to kill Overwatch 1 or Overwatch 2. I've been hearing that one way too many times with Apex, Valorant, and so on. Ultimately, Overwatch 2's hero cast and polish is going to appeal to certain people, and people that don't like Overwatch 2 may like Marvel Rivals for different reasons. It's apples to oranges, really. One thing that Marvel does have going for them is they have the opportunity to learn from Overwatch 2's mistakes, and they have a pretty strong title behind it. You see, what's made Overwatch 2 so successful is they've been able to essentially develop a brand of characters and heroes that are recognizable and really pop culture all over the world. And Marvel Rivals already has that going for them because everybody knows Marvel heroes, and they have a huge fan base behind it. However, they'll have to prove either they have great gameplay or a more appealing personality, because as of right now, both feel a little bit dry. One thing that Overwatch has going for it is that the passion of the developers in the art, hero design, sound design, music, everything. It's just almost irreplaceable for the fans of that genre. And it's the best in first-person shooter gaming, period, in my opinion. This game, even with a lot more polish, is unlikely to top Overwatch in that aspect. So it desperately needs competitive integrity and engaging kits, something that's been Overwatch 2's Achilles heel for quite a long time. Let's also talk about esportsification of the scene. I think right now we like to think back of the good old days of the great games that we used to play, but if you actually look at those games under the microscope, a lot of those games were not very well balanced, laggy, broken, and even in Overwatch 1 state, the initial launch of the game might have been really fun, but it was really, really crappy in terms of balance. It was just fun, unique, and fresh. And frankly, any game that wants to do successful needs to make sure that it is fun and it is unique. So Marvel's challenge needs to be, is it balanced? No, it needs to be, is it fun? Is it enjoyable? And balance does help with that, but it's by far not the most important aspect. If Marvel Rivals is going to be successful, it's going to need to be a fun and fresh new experience, not necessarily just a balanced one. And finally, maybe this one's a bit more personal, but I do think I speak for a lot of people that I'm just tired of Marvel. Marvel's been dominating our culture for the last 15 plus years, and while there were many moments where it was actually really great, a lot of great TV shows and a lot of great movies, especially in the last 4 or 5, even 6 years, I feel like the quality has really diminished to the point to where I'm just not interested in Marvel TV shows or movies anymore. I'm not interested in the characters, and I'm just not even interested in the comics anymore. And now, while there are going to be a lot of diehard Marvel fans, for a game to be successful, at least initially, it does need to appeal outside of its niche. And Marvel's characters, while initially may have been a strong point, for other people may not be as much of a strong point as it would have been 7 or 8 years ago. People are tired of Marvel, and hopefully this isn't necessarily the Achilles heel that prevents this game from doing well. Let's move on to major gameplay issues, things that are fundamentally, systemically wrong or right with the game. I'm going to break these down into 3 categories. Number 1, fine, mostly fine, not as big of an issue, maybe overrated. Number 2, annoying. And number 3, fundamentally flawed, need to be addressed, need to be fixed moving forward. Keep in mind that this game is in alpha, so a lot of these issues are not big problems. It's expected when a game is in alpha. However, that's part of the reason why an alpha is here, is for people to give feedback on what this game needs. This is what it needs. So in terms of issues that are mostly fine, I actually think the third person wasn't too bad. It was a lot of the major critiques of people watching the game was like, oh, the third person looks awful, the third person looks awful. But the more that I played the game, the less that I even noticed that it was third person. I didn't even realize that I was in third person after playing for a couple of hours, and that's as good of a compliment as I can give it. I've never really been a big third person fan. Even back in the Star Wars Battlefront days, I felt like it was a little bit too in your face, but this game actually did it pretty fluidly, and it felt first person in a third person environment. Now, would this game do well in first person? I don't really know. I haven't put a lot of thought into the third person versus first person arguments. I think first person has a little bit less visual clutter in terms of the character model, but it does mean that you have your weapons on screen. I think as it is, Marvel Rivals in third person is actually mostly fine, and for people that played the game, it's probably not going to be as big of an issue as you think. Movement fluidity, buggy wall climbs, clunky abilities. I think in general, this game has a lot of mobility going for it, which is great. I love mobility. I think it's good game design. However, it didn't always work fluidly. This is something that's going to need to be cleaned up through the alpha and beta stages, especially with the amount of kits that have different types of mobility. I think another thing that people were talking about is sometimes the maps are super, super big. And I think this is a really good thing. And part of the reason why the 6v6 works so well. You see, one of the problems in Overwatch 1 is that a lot of the maps were very congested, which meant a lot of chokes, sustain, spam, a lot of crappy stuff like that in the 6v6 environment. But I actually think in the Marvel Rivals maps, a lot of the maps are more open, which allows the 6v6 to work a lot better. And as of now, we don't have sniper characters that are going to punish that open space and make it really cancer in the opposite direction. So as of now, I think the map design was okay with one exception. I think there's a little bit too many choke points in certain points. So sometimes we'll go from a more open space, a lot of cover, a lot of high grounds, into a very, very tight, congested area. I think those extremes can be a little bit too over the top, and maybe some more nuance in how that's approached would be really good. I think one of the initial things that was interesting as well is that in the King of the Hill rounds, basically multiple capture points, I don't know what's called in Marvel Rivals, you're allowed to carry your ult charge over from the previous round. I think this brings in an interesting gameplay dynamic that doesn't happen in Overwatch, and I think that that's actually not a bad thing. It does add a layer of complexity and skill where, let's say that this round is just a lost cause, not committing ultimates to a round that you've probably already lost and saving it for the next fight to win the next round. And then if the enemy team knows that you have those ultimates, then they have to counterplay around that. I think it's a level of gameplay complexity that I actually think could be different. It's definitely different from Overwatch 2, but I think it's worth keeping in the game. Now let's talk about the annoying things. So I think one thing here that everyone is talking about is the destructible environment. I'm going to be honest with you guys, it just feels gimmicky. I think in an esports world, I don't think this is going to be a good thing. I think this is going to be more of an annoyance, especially considering those things rebuild. And in the casual world, it's also annoying. If you're competitive about it, it feels gimmicky. If you're not competitive about it, it still feels gimmicky. I understand the appeal from like creating a trailer or wow, you can control your environment, but it's one of those things like, it's like one of those RPGs where you have to eat or sleep or drink. It's like one of those things like if it's super, super realistic, it actually gets to the point where you don't want it to be that realistic because it just becomes obnoxious. And I think this is one of those things that really, I don't think it's going to go away, sadly. I think it's too much of their brand right now, but I've honestly did not find a single time where a destructible environment was really a fun aspect of the gameplay, and I've found many times where it was really annoying to play with or against. Another little detail here coming from a competitive side of thing, there's a lot of really powerful ultimates in this game in terms of area of effect, big explosions, big massive death balls. A lot of Overwatch ultimates are similar, but one of the things that make Overwatch ultimates different is that you don't always have to use them on big groups of enemies. And in a first-person shooter environment, especially as players mature and get better, people tend to spread out, take more off angles, take more space. And a lot of the Overwatch ultimates do pretty well solo ulting or controlling space, but I feel a lot of the Marvel Rivals ultimates are pretty bad, even used in a 1v1. I think some of them will lose a lot of value if you don't exactly get the value that you want, and there's a lot of just big explosion ultimates. I think they're going to need to take a careful look at their ultimate design moving forward and make sure that not everything is an AoE explosion ultimate, because I think that actually scales pretty poorly. And I also don't think it's as interesting of a gameplay mechanic. I think the explosion mechanics are really fun with certain ultimates, but if everyone has an AoE explosion ultimate, it just is a giant mess on your screen. You have no idea what's going on, and it's not the most interesting gameplay mechanic. I find some of the more interesting gameplay mechanics in Overwatch 2 in terms of ultimates are some of the more niche ultimates like Dragon Blade, Pulse Bomb, even something like a Primal Rage, which is not an AoE explosion ultimate, it's just a play-making ultimate. I think they need to do more heroes that have ultimates like that. One other detail, quality of life detail, is the chambering abilities, buffering your abilities. Essentially, if an ability is on cooldown, you holding down the button doesn't mean that you use it when it comes off of cooldown. This is something that Overwatch has. It needs to be put in this game. Huge quality of life problem. In addition of quality of life problems, no crouching is a huge problem. It makes it really hard to lower yourself while flying. It also means that you can't hide as easily. You don't necessarily need to be quiet. I understand the whole lack of silence approach, but crouching in general is just a first-person shooter quality of life thing. I don't know why it's not Marvel Rivals. There's a delay while pressing tab to pull up your scoreboard. I think the tutorial was also severely lacking. This game didn't really provide a lot of good information outside of one character. Very similar to the Overwatch tutorial, which is also pretty bad. And in general, the game was just extremely loud at all times. I would turn on the game and it was about 30% louder than everything else on my computer, to the point where it was actually hurt my ears the first time I played the game. That needs to be something that they mix better moving forward. It's especially bad in the environment of like 12 people screaming at all times. We'll get to that one in a little bit. Speaking of which, let's get to the very, very serious fundamental problems of the game. Number one is the voice acting. I've just found to be terrible. It's not just the actors themselves. I know that some of these actors are actually really great voice actors when it comes to the scene beyond Marvel's. They've done a lot of other great games and great characters, but the lines weren't good, the direction wasn't good, the acting itself wasn't good, the spamming of those voice lines was beyond obnoxious, and then just in general, going back to that Marvel fatigue, the quirky banter just wasn't done. Now, I have hated a lot of Overwatch 1 and Overwatch 2 voice lines over the days, but I think that Overwatch has done those voice lines a lot better with a lot more character and a lot more personality, at least with most of the cast, and it felt like Marvel, just every character was just so obnoxious, almost without exception. And it just felt a lot of times that the voice acting was done on a much more budget. It felt like somebody said, it sounds like they're doing an English dub of themselves. That's the best way of describing it. It just felt like it didn't feel nearly as polished. And I don't know that that's something that's necessarily going to be better moving forward past the alpha. Moving on to the gameplay, I think the cooldowns of certain characters, let's address the elephant in the room. The portal from Doctor Strange, just one of the many examples of cooldowns that are extremely long and extremely broken. I just don't think it's good game design to have cooldowns that are unbelievably long and unbelievably broken. You're essentially just giving them a second ultimate. And I don't think that's very good game design. I think generally most games need to have cooldowns that are anywhere from the 2 to 3 second to the 15 to 20 second maximum cooldown range, and then diminish the power of those cooldowns or increase the power of those cooldowns accordingly. It's not fun going, oh, I didn't have that cooldown in that instance, so I lost or we lost. Oh, I did have that cooldown in that instance that we won. Long cooldown mechanics don't work in first-person shooters. It's too fast tempo and too repetitive with the respawn mechanic of a game mode to you not have aspects of your kit in 2 or 3 fights in a row. That's like insanity. It just doesn't work in this game mode. It might work in MOBAs and things where there's like more constant action, where there's not immediate death, but you can't have 3-minute cooldowns in a first-person shooter. It's fundamentally flawed, even if you make that cooldown really, really strong. It just leads to a lot of gimmicks. I think that there's also too few synergies in this game. I think one of the criticisms of Overwatch 1 or Overwatch 2 is that it's moved to a 5v5 environment, and that, oh, this is 6v6 back all again. It's not even close to Overwatch 1 66 because there is no tank synergies whatsoever. In fact, we'll get to the tanks in the issue, but the tanks overall don't really feel very active. A lot of the tanks just kind of exist. And so there's not very many synergies, and even though they have those synergy systems in place, they're often tricky to get, they're weird, they're specific, and as it is, there weren't a lot of abilities, whether it was the tank or support cast, that directly enabled people in the same way that the Overwatch 1, double tank, pocketing, bubbling, and so on. I think this is something they're going to need to keep an eye on. Synergies can be broken, synergies can be weak, but they'll need to keep an eye on this and make sure they're incorporating this to motivate players to introduce synergies in the gameplay without mandating it. It's a tricky balance. One other quality of life thing that Overwatch 2 has done really well with is the heal passive. Out of combat after 5 seconds, you start to heal yourself up very, very slowly. This is something that I did not realize how badly I missed it until I played Marvel Rivals, and I realized, oh my gosh, I actually have to run around and grab health packs the entire time whenever I'm taking an angle without a support. Actually, super annoying. Needs to be incorporated in the game as soon as possible. It is a great gameplay mechanic to have. It needs to be in the game. Another thing as well, which everyone's talking about, this really goes without saying, but it has to be brought up. The game is horribly optimized. I have a fairly decent machine, 4070. I stream this a lot. I play Overwatch in relatively high settings, no big problem. I was dropping frames like insane. When I was streaming this, my video camera was lagging. I had all my settings in the game set to the max, like the absolute bottom, as low as I possibly can. Heck, I couldn't even launch OBS. I couldn't even change scenes. There were so many optimization computer issues. I couldn't alt-tab out of my thing. I couldn't game capture in OBS. It's not just the optimization, just in general, the game is just not optimized for anything right now. So unless you're running literally a superhero computer, you're going to have a really hard time playing this game. And that's going to be very important to fix that, considering the amount of reach that this game needs to have. They need to optimize this game significantly. And moving along with that, part of the reason why the optimization was so bad, because the visual clutter was just as bad as Overwatch 1. Penny Parker's spider webs, the buffs, the AoE ultimates, I mean, it got out of control. And it wasn't just the fact that there's two more characters in Overwatch 2. There was so much visual clutter with so little communication at the same point in time. I think that plus the audio clutter led this to be a sensory overload and not in a good way. I think overall the sustain of the game was weird. I felt like that there were a lot of characters that had like okay, maybe balanced sustain, but then some characters in some situations where the sustain felt like way over the top. It was weird sustain. Like sometimes you can't kill anybody through that ultimate, or you can't kill anybody through that single pocket, but then that healing is not all that good. And then if Loki has a heal stack, it's really broken. But if it was weird. I didn't feel like I played enough to get a perfect read on the sustain, but they need to keep a very careful of look on the quality of life of that sustain when single target healing is too strong. And just in general, I think the support category they're going to need to keep a careful look at, as well as the tanks. I feel like a lot of the tanks were very slow and didn't do a whole lot. I think that, and surprisingly, the tank and support category in first-person shooters is just really hard to balance, and they're going to need to keep an eye on that. It's not just an Overwatch problem. Finally, this one's really important. I think it's very hard to know when and where you're being shot at. The overall visual and sound design can be very confusing and overwhelming. I think that this is something that is partly just novelty to the game, but I think one thing that Overwatch does really well, and we will make a comparison to Overwatch in this category, is it does communicate exactly when you're low, where you're low, who's shooting you, what range they're shooting you, what type of weapon. It just communicates these things, and sometimes it communicates them so well you don't even realize that you're receiving that information, and I think that this game was missing a lot of that. Very confusing visually. The audio is confusing. We've said this a bunch of times, but I cannot clarify much how important that this is for a good game experience. Finally, let's talk about hero balance. This is going to be the one where I'm going to have the briefest thoughts because I don't think I played the game enough. I played every character for about an hour, I would say. Maybe not quite an hour, just to get a general impression of the character. I'm not a pro by any means, so this is just somebody who has a good background in game design and hero design and coaching those characters, but take these with a grain of salt. We'll talk about the tanks first. Doctor Strange, I didn't get to use my E as much, my explosive aura around me as much, because it felt like it was hard to reach people. It felt strange to have, no pun intended, a character with a good, consistent range weapon that also has an ability that punishes people to get too close. I found myself sometimes struggling to be able to use that ability with the ranges that people were playing on me. I did enjoy the mechanic. The shield dynamic was really fun. The character felt really, really strong. And when I was able to use my release of my energy around, it was very fun to use. I will say that in general, that tanks with range and tanks with mobility with Strange's flight, shockingly, tanks need some form of poke or mobility to work, and I think that Strange really did both of those things. Maybe the shield spam could be a little bit broken, although I did like the animation cancel, but overall I think Doctor Strange was the most fun I had playing tank. Moving on to Hulk, I just really hated Hulk. I think the jump, just copy Winston, guys, from Overwatch 2. Just the charge mechanic was just awful. It feels weird to jump in there and then sit and look and then be able to jump out. It felt really, really awful. There wasn't really any impact of me landing on targets. The utility felt a little bit weird and out of character for Hulk. Felt hard to reach stuff. I just think that this character had a lot of issues. I did not have fun playing Hulk, and I love Winston in Overwatch 2. Moving on to Groot, the voice lines, the voices, goes without saying. Just please be careful with the voice spam. It's awful. Groot very slow. No real poke range whatsoever, so he's just a brute force hold space and shield himself out. He's basically double shield in Overwatch 2, but by himself. His wall play is obviously very powerful. I will say that the wall play in terms of the dynamics of walls that heal you, walls that damage you, damage the enemy team, you didn't really feel the impact of what you were doing with that. There wasn't really any visceral, oh, this is the healing wall, I'm feeling it, or this is the damage wall, I can feel that I'm doing extra. You didn't really feel it. And I also think that it's just, in general, if you don't feel like what you're doing is working, then it can lead to these weird feedback loops. So I think Groot was a powerful tank, but overall a really boring tank. Magneto felt like a weaker version of Strange. I like the bubble. I think the primary fire was a little bit tricky. I really like this the combo sword thing. I forget who that was with, maybe Scarlet Witch. The whole sword thing was really, really fun to use when I could use it. But again, just another really slow tank. Lacked consistent mitigation with the cooldown on his shield, and the mobility wasn't particularly great either. Magneto was fun, but honestly not that impactful, and just felt like a much worse version of Doctor Strange, as I said. Penny Parker honestly just felt like a really crappy design. Felt like a destructible builder tank. Very defense focused. It felt almost impossible to take space with her because you had to like go in and then drop your stuff, but then you had no way to tank mitigate. It basically was just an area denial tank, which doesn't really work in capture points as easily and doesn't work on attack. And even in defense feels rather gimmicky. There's no real way to take space. The mitigation is weak. The mobility is also kind of weak, although there was the grapple kind of sort of mechanic, the bungee mechanic, which was kind of cool. The utility was super gimmicky. I think Penny Parker was honestly just a significantly worse diva with some of the most gimmicky things. I've never seen a tank as gimmicky as Penny Parker, and I did not enjoy playing her, and I did not find her very effective in 90% of situations. Moving on to support here, Rocket. No real critiques there. Pretty fun. Res was a bit weird and maybe a bit broken. Again, the destructible concept of Res is a bit strange, especially considering the fact that it gave armor packs. So it was like you wanted to put it totally out of the fight, but then it gave armor packs that people want to use in the fight. And the armor packs are only like 25 health. So there's a lot of tweaking that needs to be done with Rocket. But overall, I think more mobility. The weapon felt interesting. The heals were interesting as well. Thought it was okay. Loki, I feel like was pretty fun. I do have it's hard to read Loki right now. It's weird to have a support with an invisible mechanic and then a backside mechanic, which felt kind of weak. It's honestly hard to say. There's a lot of questions about basically Healbot stacking with his copies. I tried my best to place my copies on like off angles and be able to teleport around and use it as a defensive and an enabler of offensive plays, but that might not even be good. It might be better to just throw your copies in the backline and just heal stack, heal stack, heal stack, and I'm concerned if that's the case. They're going to want to keep an eye on Loki moving forward. Mantis, fun, fluid, aim felt a little bit awkward, especially with the movement acceleration. The crit system can feel difficult to make it work because she's basically totally reliant off of getting crits for her ability to get the heal blossoms back, or whatever those things are. I think that maybe having a system where instead of you have to crit, you do have to hit shots instead might feel a little bit better. I like the way that utility felt in terms of indirect helping and managing a bunch of cooldowns. Felt like a better version of Mercy in Overwatch 1. However, I will say one thing I didn't like is you didn't always have clear feedback on exactly what you're doing. So if you pocketed or damage boost somebody, you wouldn't really get feedback that you were doing the right thing. So kind of tricky with Mantis. And I also felt that she was just a much more inferior version of Luna. I think Luna was fun. The movement felt really unimpactful. The skating thing was really just super niche, especially because you can't use it while you're shooting, last I checked. But she seems pretty strong. The ult was really silly. The animation of the ultimate is just beyond goofy. But my only real concern with Luna is the heal bot. I wonder that if, as much utility as she has, is she just going to basically resort just to being a heal bot, throwing out a sleep every now and then? I'm a little concerned about that. Her ultimate was super, super, super strong as well, so that's something to need to keep an eye on. But I think Luna was a relatively interesting support to play. Finally, finishing with DPS. I really liked Hela. Obviously, she's busted, basically can two-tap anybody. Felt like a little bit of a clunky lack of control with the Crow. I think the ult is horrible and slow and confusing. I feels like the ultimate of sucking yourself into the sky and just launching bombs. It was very disorienting. It was very awkward. It was very slow. It was very loud. It's the perfect example of an AoE ultimate done wrong. Even Iron Man ultimate and Scarlet Witch, while being annoying, felt kind of fun. Hela just wasn't. It just felt goofy. It just felt goofy. I just did not, and I don't think a single time I enjoyed playing versus a Hela ultimate or even using Hela ultimate. There's so many better AoE ultimates in this game. Maybe also too top-heavy of a hero design. Felt like basically her entire kit revolved around two-tapping and then flying away, where some of the other aspects of her utility just were really not that useful. Something to keep in mind. Star-Lord, I really like Star-Lord. Probably the most fun I had playing any of the characters. Mobility is fun. Who would have thought? The dodge mechanic was cool. I think the flight was interesting, but probably lasted way too long, and the cooldown was a little too long. Would prefer a slightly lower cooldown and probably a significantly shorter duration, just to balance things out and give you more options. It does feel a little bit rough to have your entire ultimate shut down by Doctor Strange with just shielding your entire ult. However, it's probably just as well because your ultimate is probably a little bit too strong. So I'm going to keep an eye on there. But I actually really did enjoy playing Star-Lord. Sword Lady. I think this is magic. Fun. Maybe she's bad, but I kind of found the combo mechanics pretty fun. I think the demon mechanic of summoning the demon thing was a little bit weird. Range issues with whether the demon's going to be effective or not. I also think spamming summons can be a bit of a weird balance mechanic. That might be something that's like nobody wants to shoot a demon mid-fight, I don't think. I think also forcing a teleport directional feels a bit clunky. Like sometimes I just want to teleport and just stand still, right, with my shift to be able to use one of those abilities. But I'm actually forced to move forward, and I don't like that mechanic as fluidity as much as possible. But I did enjoy playing her a lot, even though she wasn't super great. Iron Man was the worst. So bad. The mobility, the first time I pressed his flight, I literally laughed out loud because I could not believe how slow that he was moving. I thought I was just misunderstanding the ability. No, he actually moves that slow. The weapon, Swap was awkward. The beam doesn't really do that much more DPS than just shooting, which is a strange mechanic to have. The rockets are terrible. They're impossible to hit. They're even more impossible to hit when you're flying. It's just total chaos. There's just nothing really redeemable about Iron Man. I think a lot of the flying characters have a lot of the same problems where they're weirdly spammy. They're easy to shoot, especially with all the hit scan characters that are in this game. And they just don't work. They just don't work. I think flying characters in Overwatch are also partly problematic, but there's at least some more flight control, and Iron Man has absolutely nothing going for him. He's one of those bad characters that also felt unfun to play as well, and that's really like two red strikes right there. Spider-Man, fun. The swing mechanics felt a little bit awkward, like shortening the web. I kept clunking into walls. I kept expecting it to function like Wrecking Ball, and it really wasn't. So that's something to keep an eye on. But I feel like part of it was just a skill issue. Feels hard to grasp and awkward for sure, but I think there's a lot of fun in there, and especially with some quality of life changes. I think this character will be really high skill ceiling, maybe a little bit broken in the right hands, but you know, if you're good at Spider-Man, if you're good at a high mobility character, you should be able to do good things, and I think that that's partly a skill issue. Scarlet Witch, intuitive, simple, kind of boring. I think this character is going to be something to keep an eye on. She definitely feels like Moira from Overwatch 1 and Overwatch 2 in all the wrong ways. The ability to just fly away quickly, the easy to aim primary fire. Not my favorite character to play or play versus, but more of a skill check character. But we don't really like skill check characters, or at least I don't. Black Panther, one of those not that great characters, but was actually fairly fun to play with. A couple of critiques. I think the combos were fun, mobility is fun. Dash distance seems hard with melee. Like how far you dash can be hard for a melee character. I think that needs to be something that you can control a little bit easier. I think the cooldown on dash is the big one, right? Having such a long cooldown and your entire kit revolves around that. If you mess up, you're screwed, which is, you know, that's part of the skill play. But I think that they could get away with lowering the cooldown on that, or at least buffing the damage, because man, that thing does no damage actually. You like have to combo like every single ability to do something that a Spider-Man can do significantly easier, or Punisher can do 10 times easier. I think there's too much of his kit that revolves around that cooldown. It reminds me a little bit of like Power Punch with Doomfist, where way too much of it is revolved around Power Punch and not enough around Slam. And what ends up happening is there's no real choice. I mean, everything that Black Panther does is around that one cooldown. I do think that he's a higher skill character, but I think that unlike Spider-Man, where there's like a lot of different order of operations that you can do, with Black Panther, it's pretty much the same thing. It's finding a javelin or your E and then shifting and then shift, doing this. And I think that that's part of where the character is not just lacking in terms of strength, but he's actually lacking in depth in terms of ceiling. He's hard to pick up, but once you pick him up, there's not as much depth, I think. Moving on to Namor, don't even get me started. This character sucks. I think maybe even worse than Iron Man. He's not as bad as Iron Man, but he's way more boring somehow. I think you just throw stuff, you throw a turret, and then your defensive ability of going in the air but not being able to do anything and not healing yourself, and then there's no it's just may ice block, but significantly less interesting. I played this character once, and I had such little fun that I finished the round, and we went on to the second round, and I was done. I did not want to pick the character. It was just the worst. The least fun I had playing the entire game. Even Iron Man was better. So really, and again, another AoE ultimate that just does damage. There's just nothing very particularly interesting about his kit whatsoever. Big fail for me. Storm, I found her fairly fun. She didn't really sell me initially. Her primary fire feels a little bit awkward at first. She's also very slow for a speed character, which is odd. The flight control, again, is a major problem as well. It's a little bit also unclear on what lightning does. There's not a lot of feedback. Does it do more damage than your primary fire? It can't headshot, but is it AoE? What's the point of lightning outside of just spamming more damage? I found that was not super clear either. But I think Storm is something that could be tweaked. And then once they fix some of those quality of life issues and maybe clarify exactly what to be doing, I think overall that she has a lot more potential than some of the other characters that I didn't like as much. Punisher, fun. He's easy. You shotgun, you shoot. The turret setup idea is annoying. I think that's a really, really gimmicky part where you have that shield in the front where you can't be shot as much. I think that's just not a good game mechanic. It's going to be like noob stomper, tank buster nonsense. The grapple mechanic as well is a bit of a weird thing. I think one of the things that Overwatch 2 did well, or Overwatch 1 did well with Widowmaker, is that she's one of the more fluid grapple mechanics in the game, whereas Punisher just seems like an archaic, like Call of Duty style repositioning tool. It's fine. I don't really have any major complaints. It just doesn't feel as polished. So in conclusion, I think this game is missing a lot in terms of the balance side, obviously extremely top heavy, but my major complaint about this game is that feeling it's extremely top heavy in terms of fun. You see, it's totally fine to have an imbalanced game. It's totally fine for a character like Hela to be broken in the right hands, and characters like Iron Man are not that good. But the real complaint is that Hela I found fun to play, and Iron Man I didn't. Characters like Storm that maybe are not that strong but are still fun to play, Black Panther and so on, I think those are things that are okay for right now and can be fixed in the future. But the major complaint is that the number of characters, tank, DPS, and support that I just didn't enjoy playing all that much. And even in Overwatch 1, while there were definitely a lot of cheese characters initially at the launch, characters that were kind of corny, kind of easy, not a lot of skill involved, at least they were fun to play. Junkrat, Roadhog, Bastion, even Situation can be good gimmick fun every now and then, but there were way too many characters in Marvel Rivals right now that even if given the opportunity to just play for silliness, I would never touch. In fact, there's really only half a dozen characters that I would consistently consider playing over and over again. Maybe your experience is different, but that to me was the biggest concern with Marvel Rivals. Finally, I do have my concerns about NetEase as a company, their monetization principles, the passion they'll put into the game compared to a lot of the other first-person shooters titles. We'll have to wait and see. Biggest thing that I can tell you is that if you get the opportunity to play the Marvel Rivals beta, I highly recommend that you do it. I definitely think that I don't know that I'll be playing this game moving forward. I think I've pretty much put my time in and I'm going to be moving on to other games. But it was definitely worth my time to at least try. I had a lot of fun games. I enjoyed playing the different characters. And even though there were a lot of aspects that were frustrating, it was at least good, honest, casual fun. And really, what more could you want in a game? Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.